Hello and welcome to the Radiate Wellness Podcast with your host, metaphysician, Reiki master, and hypnotherapist, Christy Clemens Hoffman. Each week, we will discover teachings, tips, and tools to radiate your best life ever with practitioners, authors, and luminaries to help you on your path. Wellness, joy, peace, abundance. What do you want to radiate?
Hello and welcome back to the Radiate Wellness Podcast. Today we are radiating crazy wisdom with Jason Brett Serle, who is a British writer, filmmaker, musician, neurolinguistic programming master, and licensed hypnotherapist with a particular focus on themes involving psychology, spirituality, wellness, and human potential, all of which is right up my alley. And Jason is also the author of The Monkey and the Bodhi Tree, Crazy-Wisdom, and The Way of the Wise Fool. Hello, Jason. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello, Christy. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Nice to see you. So this is a very interesting title, Crazy Wisdom. How do you define crazy wisdom?
Okay, you've got a couple of hours? All right.
I think that would be an interesting topic.
Yeah, there's a couple of initial ways I would look at it. So if we take the analogy of the mountain, the spiritual mountain, climbing the mountain, you might take crazy wisdom to be one of the paths less trodden. It's one of the ways towards enlightenment or self-realization for the outliers, for the people who don't fit into the conventional means. And a lot of the sort of crazy wisdom or the traditions that have more crazy wisdom in them, like Indian Tantra, for example, was sort of a reaction to the stultified Buddhist monastic tradition that had become institutionalized and had become very sort of dogmatic to an extent. And then Tantra came along, which was a bunch of genuine spiritual seekers who just couldn't fit the mold, but were still very much intent on truth seeking and developing themselves. And so you see the birth of Tantra as kind of a reactionary movement, much like the original Hasidic movement in Judaism was perhaps a reactionary movement, and broadening the horizons, allowing for less conventional, more eccentric types to partake in the spiritual journey, so to speak. So in one sense, you could look at crazy wisdom as that. It's the outliers, the eccentrics, who are still genuine truth seekers and who are looking to reach the same peak, right? In another context, we could see an aspect of crazy wisdom as being the view from the mountaintop. So in that sense, we must realize that just as there's a pre-logical and a pre-rational realm of cognitive that we can inhabit born, we develop into rationality and logic of awareness that is post-logical and trans-rational. And a lot of the times when we see the world in black and white in a dualistic framework, we don't appreciate this more subtle difference. We see logic and reason, and everything that's not logical or reasonable, it's illogical or unreasonable. And the first part of this book is sort of laying out the argument for there being a post-rational and post-logical realm of cognitive awareness. And a lot of the great saints and sages, when they came out with some of their strange utterances and behavior, it wasn't a madness, it wasn't a reverting to illogical outpourings, it was made from this higher level of transcending logic. So once again, those who reach the top of the mountain would often sound a little strange, perhaps sometimes even quite mad, to the people still at the base of the mountain, because their perspectives are so radically different.
Right. In fact, in your book, you also talk about divine madness. So how does this differ from that?
Well, divine madness is another term that's often used as a synonym for crazy wisdom. And I kind of break down the differences and the nuances between them. And I seem to think and see that true crazy wisdom, there must be a high level of spiritual development that behind it, so to speak. Divine madness is something that manifests at all levels of the path, and often mystical states that take one into sort of transpersonal realms can lead to very bizarre behavior or bizarre pronunciations. And once again, it partakes of a certain aspect of this craziness in service of heightened spirituality, but it tends to be a passing phase. It tends to be related to moments of cosmic consciousness or satori or revelatory moments, rather than true crazy wisdom, which would be someone who is abiding in one of these more stabilized higher states. So divine madness is perhaps there's less control. There isn't an aspect of it being under one's control and being, as a crazy wisdom master would use it for their own purposes to illustrate some teaching or what have you. There was a holy fool, one of the Christian saints, who acted, like a madman in his daily life, and everyone thought he was a madman. And it was only after his death that it was realized that he was an intimate friend with the deacon of the church. And when he was with the deacon, he would act like a very sort of humble, quiet person, and none of this craziness would manifest. So once again, you see, it's used, it's put on as for certain purposes, and divine madness are these transpersonal states that might come upon one through different practices or through different sort of moments of mystical union that takes them out of themselves and into realms that are bizarre, and it might sort of manifest in strange behavior and strange things, but it is differentiated in that sense.
Oracle in a way to elicit a certain response. It makes me think of the fool in King Lear, was able to act foolish, but was actually speaking profound truths. I mean, is it something like that?
Well, the jester was the only one who could tell the king the truth and get away with it and not lose his head. So we do have, it's very much tied up with the sort of trickster archetype, and all cultures have this, from Hermes to Loki in Norse mythology, or Yoti for the Native Americans, this trickster clowning figure. And yes, a lot of the times the only way to step on people's corns or really point the finger at certain hypocrisy or the ridiculous elements of authority or our society is done in this jester, trickster, humorous manner, and that's the only way it can be sort of, they can get away with doing it. So it's definitely related. I would say that often the trickster personality is a more mundane aspect of crazy wisdom. It's often about making fun of authority figures and absurd rules and this sort of thing. They're sort of champions of the common folk. And I would say crazy wisdom is that, but developed into the higher end of spirituality.
Yes,
that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. No, it's the same type of concept, but it is on a more spiritual, etheric truth type of level.
Yes.
Right. So why is this so often misunderstood? This going beyond logic and reason, something we might think of as transrational thought. Why is it so misunderstood?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that we're living in a time when the sort of materialist scientific paradigm is the one that is pretty much taught in schools, in our educational system. It's the orthodox of current Western belief system, really. And if you look at how the scientific paradigm looks at logic and reason, it is their God. There is sort of nothing beyond that. So often, I think it's a limitation of that particular paradigm that sees, obviously, scientific reasoning is based upon it. Technological advances are based upon it. So you can see why it would be held in such high esteem. And yet, when you do look into all the wisdom traditions all around the world, whether explicitly or implicitly, you will find this allusion to the fact that it's not the be-all and end-all of our possible development, and that there are these states that can be cultivated beyond that, And what are these states? When we start to sort of analyze them, you can quite easily see that there is this pre-logical phase of development, and there is the possibility of a post-logical, where we return to capture such things as our intuition and things that are not so easily considered through the lens of science and logic and reason. It's only through the development of them that you can actually realize some sort of proof of them existing.
And I think of this kind of notion of the fool and just kind of an elevated form of that. It's like sometimes we take these things so very seriously, and sometimes we do need to look at them through perhaps not a foolish, but like a through the you know what I mean? A simpler type of way of looking at it, lighthearted, more light type of way of looking at some of these things.
Yes.
Mhm.
Well, I think one of the aspects of, as we move closer towards truth with the capital T, I think it's not about coming up with the definitive perspective. I think truth is about being able to manage multiple perspectives on the same thing. And the more perspectives we can manage, the broader is our understanding, and therefore the closer to that sort of truth we move. Whereas, we're not used to doing that. We're used to very much having opinions about things, and it's very one-sided. It's either this, and if it's not this, then it must be that. And we have this tendency, we have this dualistic propensity in us anyway. And I think when you get closer to these more elevated truths, you have to begin to use multiple perspectives. And there is a certain madness from the conventional point of view of doing that, because a lot of these sages, they were attacked for not being consistent. And of course, if you're not repeating the same sort of opinion or argument or truth every time, then you will be accused of that. But the fact is, what they're trying to explain is very nuanced, and it's context based, and it's who am I talking to and what's their level of understanding, and not everyone can assimilate the same information. So they talk to one person in one way and another person in a different way, and they're not being erratic in doing that. They're being appropriate to the moment. And I think an aspect of crazy wisdom is that sort of, you can't quite put your finger on it. We like to put our fingers on things and pin things down, and truth is ambiguous and flowing, and it sort of moves, escapes our grasp. So I think that's absolutely another aspect of it. So there must be humor, there must be playfulness when one realizes that. And life is not one thing. Life is many things. There are many events in our life that might have been tragic when they happened, and yet 10 years passes and certain things have been the necessary outcome of that you're absolutely happy with. And therefore that traumatic moment loses its traumatic aspects and becomes actually a boon in your life. So what is it really? Well, it isn't anything. It's all of those things and everything between, and it escapes once again our want to pin it down as being something in particular. So life is tragic, but it's also a comedy. So what is it really? Well, it's all these things all together, and you have to deal with it if you want to get closer to something resembling the truth. You can't you can't settle on one simple way and be happy that you've figured it all out. It's harder than that.
Try to figure it out, or we can live our lives, right? And you're right. It's not any one thing that we can pin down, but our minds would want to work that way. But it's this and that. It's D, all of the above. And our job is to simply to take all of the meaning out of it that we can, I think. Now, what are some historical examples of this crazy wisdom? I don't want to take too much of your time, but I would like to ask you a few simple favors. First of all, please rate, review, and share this podcast wherever you're listening. It sounds like a simple little thing, and it is, but it has a huge impact for us because it helps other people find us in the podcasting algorithms. I don't know how it works, but I do know that it helps a lot. Next, if you would subscribe or follow wherever you're listening, whether that's YouTube or Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Pandora, Spotify, wherever you're listening, just hit subscribe or follow, and that helps you and it helps us. It helps you because then you receive notifications when we have a new episode that's out. It helps us because, again, algorithm magic, I don't know what happens, but it helps. And then finally, you can support our podcast in a tangible way by going to radiatewellnesscommunity.com/podcast and then click on support the show. Now, we have a new feature too. We are now on Patreon. You can find us on Patreon. You can also find the link to Patreon when you go to radiatewellnesscommunity.com/podcast. So on Patreon for $3 a month or $5 a month, you can support your metaphysical and spiritual growth. You can learn about upcoming guests and you can get early and ad-free versions of the shows. So please support us. This podcast is free for you to listen, but we have costs, and quite frankly, they come out of my pocket. So if you like this content, if you get a lot out of it, please see what you can do to give back. Thank you so much.
Well, so the book's divided into two parts, and the first part is a sort of theoretical look at crazy wisdom, at some of the luminaries from different traditions, the Mahasiddhas, and some of the original Taoist sages. The second part of the book is a collection of 151 stories, teaching tales. They're the parables that put crazy wisdom into a more practical context. So I don't know, would you like me to read you one of them?
Yes.
An example of... Okay, so this is one called Is That So? The Zen master Hakuin was well known throughout the land, not only for his deep wisdom, but also for his moral purity. Not far from where he lived was the home of a beautiful girl whose parents ran a small grocery store. One day, the parents found out that the girl was pregnant, and they pressed her to discover who the father was. After continued pressure, the girl relented and named Hakuin as the father. When confronted by the angry parents with the accusation, Hakuin's only response was, "Is that so?" Once the child had been born, it was brought to Hakuin to look after. By this time, the once respected Zen master's reputation was in tatters. Even so, he cared for the infant impeccably, taking care of the baby's every need. After more than a year had passed, the girl's conscience began to weigh heavy on her, until she could stand it no longer. Finally, she told her parents the truth, that the real father of the child was a man who worked in the local market. Full of shame and remorse, the parents rushed to visit Hakuin and beg his forgiveness. As they fell to their knees before him, apologizing profusely for their mistake and the indiscretions of their daughter, whilst explaining the situation and the identity of the real father, all Hakuin had to say as they took the child back from him was, "Is that so?" So this is one of the stories that's supposedly based in truth. This was something that actually happened. And there's a combination of different stories that illustrate different aspects of crazy wisdom and unconventional behavior that arises from a higher level of understanding, perhaps we could say. So yeah, there are stories about Zen masters and some of the holy fools in Christianity, certain Sufis in the Islamic tradition. And there are a number of stories based upon I don't know if you know the character of Mullah Nasruddin?
No.
Okay, so Mullah Nasruddin is the Arabic wise fool archetype. So there's literally thousands of different stories. Some of them are sort of crude jokes, and some of them are used by the Sufis almost like the Zen tradition would use koans as these deep teaching tales that a student would kind of ponder over for weeks or months at a time. And of course, this wise fool character, who is the protagonist of all these stories in the Arab world, is Mullah Nasruddin. So there's many of those stories which are, for the most part, fictional, but all do something to explain aspects of this crazy wisdom. So in the first part, there are some of these tales told in my explanations, such as the Zen master Gutei and his famous cutting of one of his students' fingers off, which led to his immediate enlightenment. So there's a number of these Zen stories where there's elements of violence and people are hit by sticks and things, but it seems to be just at the right moment that leads to this either awakening or deep realization. And so that's dealt with in the first part as well. And then these parable-like teaching tale stories given in the second part to familiarize people with more the practical aspects of what some of these saints and sages got up to.
In addition to these stories, these parables, these koans, how do we see this concept in art and culture throughout history?
You know, I think any good artist has to push the boundaries of their art, right? And any good artist is trying to escape their own innate tendencies, right? So, you know, as a musician, there are certain chordal structures or melodic structures that you were naturally drawn to, and most musicians spend their careers trying to break that and trying to get out of that and trying to expand that sort of those boundaries. And writers, we have set phrases that we tend to, you know, we have ways of expressing ourselves. What's truly important is what we're trying to communicate and the emotional states that we create in the reader or the other person. Then we must do something to continually undermine those tendencies and push the boundaries of our own art. So I think there are plenty of examples, both modern and going back in time, that show how that's just a natural process of, and how many eccentric artists can you find? I think it's very much hand in hand with being an artist. There's a certain element of eccentricity. They're not your most common types of people. And also, if you look at the development of these traditions like Tantra that I mentioned before. Prior to Tantra, the sort of Buddhism revolved around the Theravada tradition and their sutras. There was no chanting, there were no songs. That wasn't looked upon, that was frowned upon in Theravada Buddhism. And along came Tantra, and now we have dohas, which are these spontaneous songs of realization, which has flowered into its own art form. And so, yeah, once again, you see how people pushing against the current or the conventional current are constantly coming up with new ways that become in themselves their own art forms.
Impressionism comes to mind, Dada comes to mind.
Yes.
Right? These new ways of doing things, Jackson Pollock and modern art.
Sure. Once they figured out how we paint something beautifully as it is, now we have to mess with that and create something else that reaches other emotional aspects of the human being, right? And it broadens their artistic palette, so to speak.
Speaking of art and creation, etc., you are also a filmmaker.
Yes.
Tell me a bit about your films and what got you into that.
Well, everything that I've done, whether it was the sort of the music or the filmmaking, it really sort of grew out of my love of language, my love of communication, and my love of communicating what I consider to be fascinating themes, ideas, and concepts. So my filmmaking was sort of arose out of reunion that I had with an old school friend who was making short films and making sort of short films. And it was the first time that I sat down and saw that, wow, you don't need thousands of, euros of expensive equipment. And he had a PC and he had a camera and he was doing really spectacular things. And it revived this idea that I had since my youth of watching David Attenborough documentaries and things. I've always been fascinated by the ability to have the spoken word accompanied by audio visuals. It seems a really complete method of communication. And so I started helping him out with this and learning how this was done. And we set up a small company where we were making these short films, everything from weddings to music videos and video shoots of photographers and whatever we could get, really. But for me, it was always with a view of making some sort of documentary. And that coincided with my studying of NLP. I went to London for some intensive courses with Richard Bandler. And that was just a really eye-opening thing as well. It gave me this whole new lens to view life through and society. And it gave me all these linguistic methods of, on the one hand, dealing with people therapeutically, but these methods have got into, publicity and politics and all these other areas as very powerful ways to manipulate people's opinions and ideas and this sort of thing. So the two came together, and my first full-length documentary is called Mind Your Mind, a primer for psychological independence. And it looks specifically at all these psychological techniques that are being used on a day-to-day basis through film and publicity and what have you, and politics. And it lays out these techniques for people to become more aware of them, because the more aware you are of these techniques, the less they affect you. So the more we can take back control over our own decisions rather than sort of delegating them out unwittingly to other interests that necessarily align with our interests. So that took me off into filmmaking, and I realized that, yeah, with a half-decent camera and some good ideas and a decent PC, you can go ahead and make these things. So I've made 2 full-length documentaries now, yeah.
All right, so taking this idea of crazy wisdom, how do you feel it applied to your filmmaking?
I feel it applies in all aspects of my life. I suppose from my teenage rebellious years, I've had a strong eccentric streak. I've liked eccentric people. I've idolized eccentric musicians in my early years, and that sort of morphed into, rather than musicians, saints and sages and the wisest of the wise. And it doesn't take too deep a look to find that they're everywhere, and all traditions have these people that are just real mavericks and very iconoclastic and uncompromising in their authenticity. And it's always seemed to be hand in hand with this urge that I have to find truth at all costs, to find myself under the baggage of expectations of your parents and society and all these other things that we're sort of laden with. Somewhere beneath that, there's an absolutely unique being that's me and that's you, and there's never been one and there'll never be one. And I think that if we're really honest with ourselves and we really start to find that, we are eccentric. We're all eccentric. And often you find that with your most intimate friends, because they're the ones that you can be truly yourself with, and they're not sort of thrown off by it. But then we have this alternate sort of cleaned up mask, social mask, that we have for other interactions. But underneath that, there is an authentic self. And I'm of the belief that all of our authentic selves are somewhat strange, somewhat iconoclastic and eccentric. And I've kind of learned to sort of embrace that in me from quite a while back. And I encourage other people to do the same. And I think Crazy Wisdom, one aspect of it is allowing people to be themselves, truly be themselves, no matter what the consequences.
This concept does lend itself very well to that, so we can get out of our programmed thinking and liberate our minds, as you say in your film, ditch the programming that we have.
So my first film is very much, it's dealing with a serious theme. It's dealing with some very important information, and I'm doing it in a playful manner. It's not taking itself too seriously. It's trying to be, I'm not making an attempt to make people laugh either, but I'm trying to do it as I am. And if I'm being honest with the way I like to deal with people in any way, then that's what you get, I guess, with it.
Now, if somebody wanted to dive into this idea, this concept of crazy wisdom for themselves, how would they get started?
Go out and get this book if you're at all interested in it, I would say. It's a very good, broad, introductory theme to Crazy Wisdom, and it gives people a lot of different names to go and look up for themselves. Everyone has they'll vibe with certain ones and perhaps others not, and that's for everyone to go off and investigate. There's quite a considerate bibliography at the back as well for people to go off and discover people who they find more interesting. But yes, useful if people aren't familiar with this. and they're at all interested in the landscape of spirituality, the potential for human development, the nuanced elements of craziness and wisdom and how they relate to one another, because they perhaps relate more than we give credit for initially, then yes, I think any of the people I mention in this book is a whole world of investigation for those people who are interested. And the 151 teaching tales at the back, I don't know. I haven't come across people that doesn't enjoy those type of teaching stories, playful, humorous, and with some deeper aspect to them that either reflects our own folly back to us so that we may become conscious of it, or highlights truly mad aspects of our day-to-day lives that we don't consider to be mad at all. We consider to be, utterly conventional. So yeah, I think there's much in here for many different people.
I think so too. And I like this concept of every one of us has got a bit of this madness within us. And I think we don't recognize that often enough.
For
And
sure.
recognize that, yes, my madness may actually be something larger than I think, I may actually be onto something. I may actually be tapping into some larger truths. I think that can be quite revelatory.
Absolutely. It's part of our gift. And as you were talking about the artists, it was only the artists who went out on a limb and went against the grain and thought, hey, I know this is kind of mad, but I'm going to throw paint at this canvas and see what happens. Now that's a kind of respected branch of an art form in itself. But you have to realize that the first people doing it, they were looked at as complete nutters. So yeah, it's part of our gift, I think.
Why not branch out of our box? Now, you've got a website that has all of your information. That is Jason Brett Serle, JasonBrettSerle.com. We can find your writing, your film, your interviews, your FSL. So this sounds a bit like your neuralistic programming, full spectrum.
Sure. Yes, it's an outgrowth of my training as NLP master and hypnotherapist, but my own path has included, alternative health and spirituality. So it's not so narrow as to be dealing specifically with typical psychological issues, entering into what we might call coaching and these sort of areas of people who are looking for guidance in many of these themes that aren't traditionally dealt with, but with the backbone of NLP and hypnotherapy as the main tool.
Right. So all of this and more is at your website, JasonBrettSerle.com. And where can people find The Monkey and the Bodhi Tree?
It's on Amazon. It's on Collective Inc., who is the publisher. If it's not at your bookstore, they'd be able to order it for you. So yes, most people go online and just a word search will bring up, I think, Barnes and Noble as well, stock it. So yeah.
Pretty much anywhere fine books are sold.
Indeed. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for meeting me today. And thank you for your patience in scheduling. It has been a bit of a journey. So I appreciate all of this. And please stay in touch. I think you've got a lot of information to share. So I'd love to have you on after the next book as well, or next film.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Don't know what to watch next? Decisions. Well, we've got some suggestions. You can click this little video here and watch that. It's something that we think you're going to like. If you like the last one, you're going to like that one too. You can also click on the subscribe button. And if you do that, then you'll get notifications whenever we have a new video up. Win-win, right?